Hi and welcome to the Imagine Film Festival 2023 podcast series consisting of 4 episodes that explore this year's festival theme, which is Fantastic Alchemy. My name is Stanley Guzinski and I'm a features and XR programmer of Imagine Film Festival.
Hi, I'm Hugo Emerzau and I'm a freelance film critic and a curator, plus the co-host of this exciting new podcast series.
So, why alchemy? Alchemy is in equal terms magic and storytelling, and in that respect it is very close to the DNA of Imagine, which revolves around fantastic fiction. We began to wonder if it is a dead historical tradition or can we draw some energy and inspiration from it. Instead of featuring films specifically about alchemy, we asked ourselves what works could be considered alchemical in spirit and help us see what alchemical elements might still be relevant today. We wish to revive the alchemical spirit and invite the audience to look at alchemy, not as a historical curiosity, but as a source of inspiration for addressing contemporary challenges through the mix of 4 ingredients: technology, narrative, identity, and substance, which will manifest in film screenings, VR works, conversations, workshops, live events, exhibition, and podcasts.
Alchemy was an invitation to learn through diverse means: reading, observing, listening, but also touch, play, destruction, and transformation. And as our society struggles against the dangers of populism, grapples with the developments of AI, and comes to terms with the fluidity of identity and gender, we are, in fact, in desperate need of such powerful interdisciplinary paradigm, which would help us connect our lived experiences with reliable knowledge.
And if that sounds a bit eccentric and far-fetched, we have this podcast to make it feel less so. In this episode, we explore the topic of narrative, examining how the power of interpretation can transform its objects and radically alter the way that we see and engage with the world around us.
Specifically in this episode, we're honing into George Sluijzer's 1988 masterpiece Spoorloos, arguably one of the greatest Dutch films to ever be made. Often perceived as a landmark film in the psychological thriller genre, our 2 guests of today offer dissenting but much more complementary readings of Sluijzer's film as a horror and alchemical text per se.
Our first guest of today is Karen Pinkus, a professor of Romance Studies at Comparative Literature at Cornell University, whose daring interpretation of Spoorloos as an alchemical text par excellence in her 2009 book Alchemical Mercury, A Theory of Ambivalence, gave us an inspiration to present it at the festival. So, our screening of Spoorloos will be an invitation to our audience to a collective game of interpretation, looking for clues and symbols supposedly hidden in the film, and we hope this episode will convince all of you that it is worth a shot.
Karen Pinkus will be joined by British film critic and writer Christina Brennan. Her upcoming book, to be published in the Devil's Advocate series of Liverpool University Press, examines Sluijzer's Spoorloos through the framework of international horror cinema, subtly shifting the dominant interpretation of the film into more fruitful and rewarding terrain. Alongside these guests, we will, through the power of interpretation and narrative, give new life to one of the most celebrated films in Dutch film history, making it an alchemical gesture into itself.
Let's dive in. First of all, thank you so much, Christina and Karen, for accepting our invitation and joining us on the podcast. Today's episode is about the movie that for many people is the best Dutch movie ever produced. So a lot of people share that opinion. And for me, it was one of the first Dutch films that I saw after arriving in Netherlands. Myself, when I was taking a Dutch film class. And that was, I have to say, quite an experience for me, seeing that for the first time. And I was actually blown away that I didn't know about that film before my arrival in Amsterdam. So before we go more in depth into your respective readings of Spoorloos, I would be very interested to learn how you came across the film in the first place, because I know that it made quite a splash in the 1990 where it came out. But since then, I'm not so sure how present it is in circulation in let's say, more Anglo-Saxon world. So how did your story with Spoorloos begin?
I think it's good for Karen to begin with this one, though.
Okay, sure. Yes, I saw it when it first came out in the US, and it made quite an impression on me at the time. Just as, on the one hand, a kind of ordinary story of a couple who are going on vacation together with this incredible twist at the end. And I was always kind of interested in alchemy. So I do remember, even at the time of seeing it, that it had alchemical imagery in it. But that was a little bit in the background. And then later, when I came to be working on alchemy as a scholarly topic, I came back to it and watched it again.
Did you consciously revisit the film, remembering this alchemic part that you noticed at the first viewing, or was it a thing that maybe kind of struck you after the fact, like, wait a minute, if I like just putting on Spoorloos again and just seeing those connections much more explicitly?
No, I really remembered it from the first time I saw it. But I hadn't realized to what degree that images of alchemy were spread out throughout the film. And then I sort of came up with a reading of the whole film, which we can talk about later.
Yeah, and how about you, Christina? What was kind of like your first experience of finding this film, and what kind of like mark it left you with?
So I first came across the film when I was a teenager. And it was kind of, when I first came across it, the end, it was already spoiled for me because it was part of this big program that they do. Maybe they do it in the US. They do like the top 100 scariest moments, like every 5 or 10 years, and they kind of rank horror films and psychological thriller films. And Spoorloos was, I think, number 30 in that, alongside like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, really, really iconic horror films. And I remember thinking that was a kind of a more unknown film that I wanted to explore. There was kind of other titles that I'd heard about. But I think what really I found interesting was that it felt more like a road movie and kind of a more realist film. You don't quite know it's going to be horrifying until really the final few moments. You think it's kind of a love story, a tragic love story, and then it's really turned on its head in the final closing sequence. So I felt that it really kind of challenged subvertive kind of traditional or cliche perceptions of what horror could be. And it, again, has kind of cropped up in kind of popular culture in the UK. You talked about kind of the Anglosphere and how well known it is. I'd say it has quite a cult following. There's a kind of a UK critic called Mark Commode, who's kind of the most prominent critic really coming in the UK at the moment. This is one of his favourite films in one sense. He sees it as one of the scariest moments in cinema, which is the ending. So I kind of was fascinated by the kind of genre of it that didn't fit traditional kind of ideas of what kind of scary horror might be, but also that it had this kind of reputation and fan base kind of across different countries that has kind of, I guess, grown over the years. So it was kind of when I was very young, but I've kind of come back to it again and again. It's kind of a more interesting, challenging film.
It's funny because, like, I, as the designated Dutch guy of us four, you know, I have a totally different experience of first engaging with this film, because in Dutch high school, almost every Dutch teenager reads the book that the film is based on, Tim Krabbe's The Golden Egg, Het Gouden Ei. The reason for that being is that it's a piece of established Dutch literature, but it also has all these, you know, genre and thriller-esque elements, and at the same time, Krabbe's literary prose is very accessible and economic and but really speaks to the imagination. So it's the ideal book for a teenager to get into the quote unquote canon of Dutch literature. So I first read the book, and then, you know, as many teenagers do, when you have a book exam, you don't only read the book, you also watch the film, because that's much more fun than reading a book at that moment in your life. And I do remember being struck by the film because I expected something more scary than in maybe a more explicit visceral way. And then it's only afterwards that I felt so incredibly unsettled, and I couldn't really source where that came from. Maybe I think it's a film that can easily fly over your head when you're not in the right mind space for it yet. Now we've turned into it a couple of times. The film just keeps giving and growing, and I'm very excited to have you both here because you've both invested quite a big part of, well, your work and appreciation in this film. And through those readings, I think the film will only grow. So I'm very excited to explore that a little bit more, the time and effort that you've put into decoding and dissecting this brilliant film.
Yeah, and one reason why we decided to program it, obviously it's Karen's reading of all these alchemical symbols, but we were ourselves interested in this notion of alchemy of narrative, of how the interpretation can actually transform or transmutate the text itself. And I think most of the Dutch audience knows it as this terrifying thriller with a twist ending, as Christina summarized it. And all of a sudden, through, I think, both readings, both of your reading, Christina, and your reading, Karen, it just keeps revealing new layers. And out of curiosity, we looked at a couple of passages from the book as well before this podcast with Huho. And it's quite surprising how many elements are actually added in the movie, and how much of this symbolism does not exist in the book, which is very sober in its use of language as well. So I hope we'll get to talk about all these transformations and transmutations. But let's start maybe with you, Karen, because this is when we thought about this angle, we fantasized about well-known movie that we can show to our audience here that all of a sudden will be completely transformed by the reading. And while researching the subject, like I just came across the chapter of your book from 2009, Alchemical Mercury, where you proposed this alchemical reading of Spoorloos. And interestingly enough, like I couldn't find any other voices that were corroborating this reading other than yours. And after rewatching that film yesterday, having your reading in the back of my mind, I felt like this is so obvious. I mean, that everything is in plain sight. But can you tell us a little bit? You of course hinted at your initial reading of it, but to the unsuspecting audience, let's say, who has not have this film in the recent memory, could you tell us a little bit about this imagery and symbols and all this alchemical meanings that this film is infused with?
Right. Let me just go back for a minute and say that I also read the book and reread it just to prepare for this discussion. And other than the title, which has a vaguely alchemical aura to it, there's no alchemy in the book itself. The book, as you say, it's very sparse prose. It's very, there are a number of different anecdotes. It's really the story of a couple and then another couple later on, when when Rex moves on to another woman. And we can talk more about the sparseness of the prose. But then when you get to the film, the golden egg is still there, and the golden egg is sort of a common image from alchemy. But there are so many others as well that were added into the visual imagery of the film. And of course, we haven't mentioned the Hollywood remake of the film, which maybe isn't even worth mentioning at all because it's pretty awful. But in that Hollywood remake, again, all of the alchemical symbolism is completely vanished, so to speak. So, we can point to a number of images in the film, again, beginning with this idea of the golden egg, which is a kind of a nightmare that about floating in space or being inside this enclosed vessel where you can't really get out. That if you look at, say, collections of alchemical imagery, many of which were produced in the Netherlands in the 17th century, that was a key moment, you would see that kind of image. You would also see many, many images of the king. And of course, the main character is Rex. You would see things like perhaps the burial of money when they bury a coin outside of the gas station, the ladder, the fact that the young Rex, when he's just a boy, is reading an alchemical book called the Mutus Liber, or Mute Book, before he jumps off of the balcony.
I think, in fact, it's Raymond.
Yeah, it's the young Raymond. And I want to add, because that's one of the passages that we were, revisiting from the book. If you read the book, it just says he is reading a book. It just doesn't matter for the story which it is.
Yeah, so we can get into this more, but there are quite a number of these symbols throughout the film, and they don't really advance the plot. I mean, it can work without them, as we see in the book, but even if you think about the film, if you read it as, say, as Christina suggested, really a realist film that doesn't use any cinematic tricks or even, formal innovations like an experimental film would. And you see some of the very banal settings, the highway, the gas station, the parking lot, and even the country house in France. None of these are really suggest a kind of deeper reading. It's just sort of, a film about something, that happens between a couple. But then if you start to think about it in alchemical terms, you see that it's not really just a series of symbols thrown in there. Really, especially when you get to the ending, it's really about this question of what I call ambivalence that I think is really crucial to something almost universal about alchemy. And it's not just a dialectic, say, light and dark, although that's very crucial in the film, for example, in the scene in the tunnel.
And the motivation of Raymond as well.
And the motivation, but also the idea that that the film is suggesting that there's a kind of pursuit of knowledge, and you want to know, but you don't want to know. And then once you know, there's no going back. And that really what we're talking about, in a sense, is a narrative that is much more than just a detective story. And in fact, we could almost say it's a police procedural with no police. That's something we can talk about as well. But that in alchemy, in alchemical imagery, you will often see this coming together of the king and queen, or the male and female, or these two different elements, sometimes even in a coffin, in order to be reborn, to have this redemptive renewal at the end. And we don't have that, though, because there's simply the burial and then it's the end. So I do think that reading the film in relation to ambivalence and the uncanny makes it a lot more than just a sort of, I don't know, a horrific account of pure evil. I mean, we can discuss whether Raymond actually is purely just evil or if there's something more going on.
Mm-hmm. Could we just stay for just a second longer on this notion of ambivalence? Because I think it's very crucial to your reading, if you read the whole book, to your reading of what alchemy is. Because like in this series of podcasts, we also try to ask this question of what is still relevant in this whole paradigm of alchemy today for us. Is it the imagery of like this DIY magicians locked in their labs, or is there something in this mode of thinking that is still interesting? And you pinpoint as one of those more important aspects of alchemy that question of ambivalence. And as you said, this certain attitude of wanting to reach a goal but delaying the goal, which is interesting because if you speak about the production of a couple in this film, they are going to be together, and all of a sudden it's all disrupted by this great plan of Raymond. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a complicated issue because so many people have studied and written about alchemy at different times, right? And I think even in Amsterdam, there's a really famous collection of alchemical works, which are under the sign of a kind of Rosicrucianism or a kind of fraternity of men. There's still this idea that alchemy is this mysterious knowledge passed down from, say, father to son. So I have a very a kind of a feminist approach to it as well. And many people are still interested in it. And as you kind of hinted at, I think even Harry Potter has aroused, new interest, at least in a kind of magic with a sort of chemical basis. But my understanding of alchemy is not really the same thing as magic. It's actually really about combining of two elements that belong together and yet can't really be together. It's a paradox that can't just be resolved. And that's what I see as I call something like the least common denominator of alchemy, rather than saying it's something universal and found everywhere and throughout history, which is true, it is, but then we'd have to say, account for why is it everywhere, and who and what kind of psychic structure would make it persist. But again, I'm much more interested in this idea of this paradox that two things should come together, but they can't, but they must.
There's a quite beautiful symbolic scene in the film when Raymond is traveling with Rex already, and they start talking about Dutch names. Yeah. And they make this remark that the names in themselves already contain these contradictions, but it even gets more interesting when people marry, and one surname is merged with the other one, and then they create those weird mergers. But with that in mind, like, I would like to ask Christina, first of all, like, when you hear about this alchemical reading, like, what is your immediate reaction? And the other thing, there is another ambivalence that you explore in the reading of Spoorloos, which is this spectrum between reading it as a kind of like a thriller, psychological thriller, and a horror film. So I guess my question is twofold. Like, first of all, like, your immediate reaction to this alchemical reading, and that other tension or aporia that is hidden in the existing readings of that text.
So I think there's a lot that's recognizable in what Karen said, and that overlaps with some of my reading as well. I think with the golden egg, the thing that strikes me is kind of how, you know, both the color, the shape, the imagery of the egg, it symbolizes life, fertility, hope, and really it becomes kind of a symbol of something that's the opposite. It's the foreshadowing in some way of what will happen to Rex and Saskia and how they'll be brought together. So the symbolism and the ambivalence is something that the director plays with incredibly well over the course of the film. I think in terms of kind of how I approach the film and kind of the structure of it and the themes and genres within it. So I look at it first as kind of within its context in the late 80s. So in the terms of kind of violence and within cinema of that period. I think up till that point, cinema and horror cinema had been sort of seen as kind of a gory, excessive, kind of more entertainment. This was the decade of the franchise. And there were films which were beginning to kind of challenge that, but weren't being recognised as horror films. So Spoorloos, in kind of like original reception, was seen as a kind of Hitchcock-style thriller with a twist that kind of echoes films like Vertigo. And so for a long time, the kind of horror label was sort of treated, it wasn't really referred to in relation to this film. I think there was a film that came out the same year, Amsterdam, which was much more about kind of a more traditional serial killer pursuit film in Amsterdam. And it was compared as kind of, this film is far more highbrow than Amsterdam. So it was seen as, they wanted to distance something like Spoorloos from the horror label because it was gaining kind of global currency and reputation. But there's been kind of critics who've done a bit of work since then trying to kind of recapture and understand these links. I build on the work by a scholar called Kevin Winter, who talks about the continental horror film that kind of came about in the late 80s. And begins to kind of recognise in works like Michael Haneke, the Austrian director, kind of a sense of kind of exploring the banality of evil, the evils and disasters that come about by random chance and random encounters. Kind of the violence in Spoorloos is very random, like whether Rex and Saskia meet Raymond is kind of a matter of chance. Then kind of how the film is kind of structured, it's through kind of random encounters in the gas station. And so there's kind of a sense of these kind of strange themes that are building up in the 80s and 90s that I think Spoorloos actually foreshadows quite well, and kind of foreshadows themes that are in kind of 90s cinema from France under the New Extremity movement. These are kind of much more violent films, but there's a kind of exploration of the randomness of violence, which I think Spoorloos kind of foreshadows and echoes as well. So I think there's kind of been a journey for the film in its reception over the past couple of decades. And I think they kind of themes that kind of overlap with sort of what Karen was talking about with alchemy and change and transformation and ambivalence kind of feed into that. I think there's an ambivalence to Spoorloos as a horror film, and there's an ambivalence to some of those themes as well, which became more prominent in European cinema after Spoorloos.
And it's just such a fascinating kind of like meta trajectory of the film that through both of your readings contributing to the idea that it's such a, canonical film, an iconic film of Dutch film history transforms on itself, which is an alchemic process as well, which is quite rare actually, that a film of such a level of fame or infamy can actually, some of the readings can maybe almost radically make you reinterpret what the film itself is actually about. And I don't think there's that many like mainstream big examples of films that really get such a new level of meaning through such a new reading, actually. So that's just an incredible contribution, I think, also what you're doing. And it's going to be super interesting to see how that plays out in front of a Dutch audience of festival goers, how they will respond to this maybe kind of like changed outlook on this film.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think in that regard that the film might have been one thing, and then it sort of transforms into another thing. So earlier on in the film, when Lemorne is experimenting with using the ether because he's decided that he really needs to kill someone, he tries to get a bunch of women into his car by asking them where the post office is or the shopping mall. And he really comes off as just a kind of old, creepy molester, just a normal, creepy molester. Everyday creepy molester. So it could be that kind of film. But then in the end, he is transformed from that into something much bigger, in a sense, much more ambitious than what he was at that point.
Yeah, and the same thing that it was, Christina, I was thinking about kind of like what you were talking about, this randomness, this factor of chance playing into, how they meet each other eventually. But then at the other hand, through Raymond's ambition and dedication, you see that the chance encounter itself is an inevitability in its own right, of course, because he is so adamant on one of those chance encounters to actually be fruitful. It's just a chance that it is this particular person or this particular couple that is affected by it. But actually, in some strange way, it ties into Karen's paradoxical notion of alchemy in itself, that the chance and the inevitable are deeply intertwined with each other constantly in this film.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also the kind of modern setting is very crucial to the horror and to that theme of random chance that we've talked about as well. I think there's the contrast between kind of somewhere like the gas station, kind of the site of commercial travelers, of tourists, of kind of modern pleasures and relaxation, contrasting that to the ending, which is something out of kind of traditional Gothic fiction in the style of Edgar Allan Poe. But I think there's a symbolism as well in those kind of settings. There's an ongoing kind of sense of limbo motion. No one is quite looking, no one is quite concentrating. And I think where that being the site of where Saskia actually disappears and where Lemon or Raymond can look for a victim, kind of makes the kind of unsettling horror more acute, really. I think it also reflects perhaps Rex's psychology as well, because I think Rex is sort of caught in this kind of limbo of grief and not being able to move on. I think that's what propels the film forward, ironically, that he is sort of stuck and unable to kind of process his grief and trauma after Saskia's disappearance. And so there's this sense of kind of the anonymous nature of the gas station sort of becoming suddenly more sinister within the space of a few shots, and it becoming a place where only a disaster like the one shown in Spoorloos, that's the only kind of place that can happen, and it's so decisively modern, and so I think it kind of makes us reflect as well. We've talked about kind of the long-term build-up and evolution of themes in terms of alchemy, but also kind of the more immediate horror. It could only happen in kind of our very modern setting and world. And I think there's something about language there as well, and about being uncomfortable in kind of places where you're not familiar. Saskia is unable to actually speak French. And so when she meets Lemon, who is her abductor, she's unable to communicate with him in a way and perhaps pick up on certain cues. And I think there's kind of a more modern group of films this kind of echoes. There's I think a Danish film, Speak No Evil, about this, about like where you're in perhaps another country, you can't quite read people's, you can't pick up on cues, can't read body language or social situations in the same way, so that makes you more vulnerable. And I think that Spoorloos kind of foreshadows and echoes that, certainly. So I think it's certainly a horror that could only come about in the last few decades, and by the nature of kind of how we travel, how we relate to each other, how we move around the world.
I would just like to intervene. I mean, Christina, you called it modern, which it certainly is, but I will be really curious to hear how younger Dutch people react to it, because I mean, first of all, the clothing, the costumes, the settings, they do look a bit dated seen today. But also, this film could never happen today because we have cell phones. I mean, that's really, really crucial, is in fact, there's no way to communicate. So in that sense, I think it will be interesting to see how audiences process the lack of communication, simply the lack of clues. I mean, it's Spoorloos, there's no trace.
Isn't it then fascinating that there's three modes of communication in the film that still play an integral role? One is postcards that are also tied to, Christina, this kind of like modern, and I guess modern you mean also like a 19th century onwards mode of tourism, you know, the modern European continental form of luxury tourism almost, that in the 20th century became a quintessential middle class activity as well. But it's the postcards as this kind of like token almost of this travel industry. It's the television. It is the moment where Rex is on TV on a French talk show to basically address the kidnapper of Saskia, literally breaking the fourth wall of the TV screen to make a personal appeal to him. And then it's the computer, where he has this strange digital experience, again, with the weird confluence of names bouncing on and off of the screen. So in a strange way, the film is anticipating much more maybe than we were really discussing priorly as well. This is just an immediate response to kind of like the absence of the telephone or the mobile phone. At the other end, like Karen, I think your question is very interesting, and I think the screening that I imagine will kind of maybe be an interesting testament to that. So it would be interesting to revisit part of our conversation after that screening has happened, how many people in the audience will respond. But what for me really strikes me as being a millennial from the Netherlands is a kind of maybe quaintness of the Dutch sober aesthetic that has been kind of like cyber washed a little bit and has become more generic. There's more kind of like edgy aspects to people's aesthetic appearances. There's a more blasé kind of like gaze at the surroundings of the spaces where people immerse themselves in. It shows a kind of old Netherlands that I feel is being kind of scrubbed away in most parts. So for me, it was a quaint kind of like a quaint, nostalgic revisiting of some things that I still remember of my youth, but that have been aesthetically altered quite radically in the last decades or so.
Although I have to say, I started looking immediately when there was this scene in Rex's apartment on Google Maps, where in Amsterdam that could have taken place, and I think I found the exact spot.
I mean, yeah, architecturally, you know, many
Amsterdam's
things. Yeah, architecturally, many things haven't really changed, and there's like so many great Dutch films from film history that play in these kind of like suburban neighborhoods outside of like the Amsterdam, and all of those buildings still exist and still look the same dreary, gray, you know, brown concrete kind of lower class dwellings. This is, I think, the only timeless aspect really of the aesthetic style of the film. Yeah. But yeah.
But I guess like I would like to come back to something and maybe ask you, Christina, as well about your experience of, I imagine like multiple rewatchings of that film, because I think, like, of course, first you watch it, you are not aware of the twist that happens at the end, and then you can never watch it again in much the same manner. But also, we hinted at let's say, like a kind of like a sober style of that film. But the more you watch it, the more you start realizing that there is a certain puzzle that is hidden in the film, that is hidden there on purpose. And I think actually the writer already, Tim Krabbe, was someone who was very fond of puzzles. And we spoke a little bit about this seemingly transparent and simple style. But if we actually pay attention, there is jump cuts. For example, when Raymond is recalling what happened at the gas station when Saskia is buying the frisbee. There's also like all kinds of clues that are hidden there to be picked up, and the depth of field. When basically you watch the film, like you can watch everything that happens very far in the back. And then it kind of invites you pausing and rewatching, which is very interesting because it's a 1988 film. Yeah. But we only have easy access to those tools where we can pause and rewind right now, and we can obsess about it, which is interesting because it's also, that time where Laura Mulvey writes her text, Def 24 frames per second, and she indicates this idea of the pensive spectatorship and this type of fetishism that we like to apply to images by halting them and analyzing continuously. So I'm curious, Christina, like what changed for you during writing of the book and continuous rewatchings of that film?
Well, I think after you watch it a few times, and especially if you're trying to put together a book like mine, which kind of relates it to the whole group and canon of films, as broad as the horror genre, you begin to see a lot of different connections to kind of various periods, various kind of subgenres. So I've talked a bit about kind of films of the 1980s that were beginning to kind of become more kind of muted and meditative in their kind of approach to suspense and horror. But I think there's also kind of in terms of kind of the structure you talk about, and also the kind of way it pauses to kind of almost meditate on the kind of disorientating nature of perhaps grief and loss. I think there's kind of certain kind of parallels with films coming out today, because there's a big, I guess, debate at the moment about kind of what they call elevated horror.
Exactly, yeah. Where everything horror is supposedly about trauma. So.
Exactly, as if that's something kind of new. And actually, even by saying elevated horror, it kind of ascends above the kind of horror genre to do something a bit more highbrow than you might expect. So kind of these sort of films are kind of Ari Aster's Hereditary, Midsommar. These are kind of films that explore kind of quite human experiences, kind of grief, loss, kind of family dynamics, often through kind of the prism of kind of quite real stories, real settings, and domestic settings, I should say. But they kind of transform into kind of these kind of strange, kind of half supernatural, half realist kind of parables. And I think that there's the final section of kind of my book kind of talks about this and about how it sort of disputes the idea that there is elevated horror in the 21st century. There is, as there have been previously, an interest in psychological horror. But films like Spoorloos show that films of that genre have always explored kind of these sort of very complex, evolving emotions in relation to grief and loss, and have done it in ways that kind of disorientate us and kind of distance kind of the audience from their day-to-day life. So I think Spoorloos has certain kinds of, even kind of 30 years before kind of post-horror or elevated horror became a thing, there's certainly kind of in the way that Sluijzer presents loss, trauma, I think that there's certainly foreshadowings of that. And that demonstrates that kind of these themes are kind of an essential part of horror long before the last 10 years.
It's interesting because, Karen, I think in your book you propose the concept that comes from Giorgio Agamben. I mean, from his take on the state of exception, and you use this notion of anomie. in relation to this moments where the time is a bit suspended and we're in this moment of waiting. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's quite a complicated argument, I suppose, but in alchemy, at least, one of the primary functions of alchemy, right, is to transmute a base substance, usually lead, into a substance of value, gold. And the question is, what happens in between? And then also, what do you do with the quote unquote gold once you've achieved it? So this analogy, the alchemical analogy, right, the transmutation of something of no value into something of value gets used everywhere and could even be applied to filmmaking itself, in the sense that you, when you shoot on film, of course, you take something that is of no value, you place images on it, you put it into literally a chemical bath, and it emerges as the gold of capital that could be, you know, sold to film distributors and consumed. So I'm really interested in this period of what happens in between, and the question of waiting for the great alchemical work to happen, because it happens very, very slowly. So just to sort of summarize and then to think about it in terms of the film, it's asking us to think about the temporality of transmutation and how long it takes and what happens in between while we're, in a sense, waiting and nothing really is happening.
Which is very interesting that Christina said about this key role of psychology in this understanding of the elevated horror as well. And if we break it down into the stages of alchemical process, we have nigredo, rubedo, citrinitas, all this stuff, and of course there is a very dominant Jungian psychological reading of those elements. And interestingly enough, we can suspect that maybe George Sluijzer himself maybe arrived at some of those ideas through this because of I think of the meaning of and the significance of Mutus Liber, that book that appears in the film for Jung and his understanding of alchemy. That is something that is not prominent in your book, but Karen, could you like cast a little bit of light on that psychological take on the alchemical process? And because it is also prominent in the readings of the dreams.
If anything, Spoorloos is a Jungian film, you know.
I mean, I personally am not very interested in Jung, and I definitely steer away from a Jungian reading of alchemy. But I do want to acknowledge that Jung published, you know, works about alchemy. He published a lot of the imagery that makes up a kind of early modern alchemical canon of images, including, say, images of a king being buried alive in a tomb and then who will be then resurrected. So to be sure, I mean, he is floating around if you're interested in alchemy. I mean, my own argument goes against that because it implies that there's some sort of universal archetypes that everybody all over has inside of us, or we have introjected in some way. And that's not how I read. That's not really how I think. And in fact, I would also note that I think in his essay on the uncanny, Freud does say that the idea of being buried alive is one of the most uncanny ideas that people could have. But again, not as an archetype, not as something universal, but as something that develops in an individual unconscious.
I'm wondering, actually, because both of you have quite extensively researched this film vis-a-vis your own respective reading of it, I'm wondering, because we already established that this film has been presented and received in a more conventional label of the psychological thriller. With your slightly dissenting readings, I'm wondering if you have come across any maybe expressions of George Sluijzer himself in which he maybe corroborated or accepted part of these readings, or where he maybe also resisted them. Have you ever, maybe Karen and also you, Christina, found maybe some confirmation of your reading of Spoorloos through anything that the director himself has expressed?
Well, it's interesting because his career isn't a conventional one for a film. Obviously, like Spoorloos, it began as a documentary filmmaker for the National Geographic. He's done short films. I think he had a short film about Kennedy and his visit to Ireland, and then I think prior to Spoorloos did kind of thrillers which sort of meditate, I guess, more on paranoia and lack of certainty. I think my impression from the interviews is that he was quite open to interpretations and wouldn't necessarily give approval to certain readings or not. I think a lot of filmmakers, I think secretly or not so secretly, don't have much time for critics and multiple readings of their work. So that's my experience, which is fine. I think critics often think that filmmakers don't necessarily know what they've made either. And I think that there are broader implications beyond what they thought they were making. I think that he would, I think, appreciate the ambivalence and of the film. Like it could be a love story, or it could be a horror film. It could be a psychological thriller. I think the shape-shifting nature, what Karen's talked about in terms of alchemy, in terms of the themes of evolution of growth, I think he would understand the ambivalence of that and could understand kind of the way it relates back to kind of, I guess, more primal imagery, beliefs. I think that he wouldn't necessarily disagree with those readings, but I think he would be quite open-minded to multiple interpretations.
Yeah, I think because we brushed off in the beginning, like some of those supposedly more vivid examples, and maybe we could just come back to them for a moment, Karen, because as we say, like it's ultimately we are the alchemists, and that the task of deciphering that film and all these symbols that are in it is ours to a certain degree. But you mentioned that, for example, the golden egg is such a strong alchemical symbol. Could you maybe cast a little bit light on that? And of course, then we have, like what I said in the beginning, that it's so striking after you've read it that way, like how many things are just there on the surface. The very fact that Raymond is a chemistry teacher, that he's playing with all these concoctions, that there is mutus liber in it, and that they stop at the memorial place at some point with Raymond on the way, and there's this monument with all these golden bricks there. So could we go a little bit through those, let's say, more obvious alchemical symbols that appear in the film, and maybe you could decipher a little bit, Karen, the meaning?
Right. Well, it's a little bit difficult because, of course, there are many different variants of the alchemical narrative. As you yourself mentioned, there are different stages that these metals or figures of the metals have to go through in order to be transformed. But by the way, the author of the Mutus Liber, which is it's called Mutus Liber because it's just a book of images, there's no text at all, was a chemist himself. So that is an important symbol that this boy is looking at these images before he decides to go over the balcony. So yeah, the golden egg is very important. And again, there are different variants of it, but we see the egg a lot. Christina even alluded to this. It's a symbol of fertility and of birth and, of course, rebirth. In a lot of alchemical imagery, you'll see a man and a woman, or a king and a queen, being brought together in some kind of a clear vessel, like an egg, where you can look into it, and then they're actually heated up. There's discussion of the egg being heated so that it will then give rise to a new being that is maybe a hermaphrodite, so a combination of the male and female, a perfect symbol of ambivalence, by the way. There are a lot of wheels in the movie, a lot of round circles, and that's a very important image from alchemy. The Ouroboros, the snake that bites its own tail, or the wheel of life, or the Kabbalistic wheel. You see them over and over. And of course, in the film, The Tour de France is being run, so there's a lot of discussion of the bicycle wheels. The frisbee is a circle. We see that repeated over and over. The ladder, which we see in the film, is an important imagery from alchemy, climbing up the ladder to arrive at knowledge, or perhaps to arrive at the philosopher's stone, which is sometimes an image of knowledge. In the town, when Raymond falls off the balcony, there's a blancherie, a cleaners, but of course, whitening is one of those key stages of alchemy that you mentioned, and it's part of the tradition of alchemy that you would have a whitening stage. So those are some of the really key ones. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just, sorry, I just that was just a digression. That albedo, I think, is the whitening stage.
Yeah. Or calcinatio might be another one. Again, there are many variations on alchemy depending on which text you look at or which tradition you look at. And at least in my work, I try not to choose one over another and to say, well, this is the authoritative one, because there's so many different variants of it.
I'm wondering, Karen, like, you see all these elements in this film and you already noticed those elements partially or mostly when you first saw the film in the early 90s when it was first theatrically presented in the United States. At that time, or maybe later, or during your more intensive research into it, did you find any films that for you feel analogous to a film like Spoorloos, in the sense that you can read so many of those similar elements into them, and also in the way that they feed into the narrative? Because I think we constantly need to foreground that the central dilemma of the film itself is an alchemical one as well. Like, does he want to attain the knowledge of the things that have actually happened to his vanished partner? And does he accept the price that it costs to attain that knowledge? Which is a question of life and death, of course.
No, I think it's really unique in that regard. I mean, I did think, based on our discussion, and this is another slight digression, but I mean, another mediatic technology, if we like, that's in the film is the Polaroid.
Totally. Oh, yes.
The Polaroid picture that he takes, which captures that depth of field, and which could serve as a clue for what was happening at that one moment at the gas station, but it turns out to be a useless clue. So in the sense that the film is somehow engaged with some kind of discussion of using technology to capture imagery or to give clues, I suppose it could be read in relation to Blow Up.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's really, we move on beyond that, and this the alchemical, the way it pervades the film, not just as random images, but as a really deeply structuring element, I think is quite unique.
That's interesting.
It sort of the only thing I can think that reminds me of is kind of Twin Peaks, kind of such a contrasting format in that it's a serial drama, but in terms of it's a mystery, a disappearance, and the protagonist is kind of in a more closed setting, but realizes that there's kind of more kind of mystical activities, meanings beneath the surface. There's even, I think in one episode, it might be a more recent one, there's something about the gold orb, about conjuring memory. And I think I only really by chance kind of thought of that recently whilst watching an episode, and it is quite that they're quite different formats and quite different kind of mysteries, but I thought there was some sort of strange echoes there between Spoorloos and Twin Peaks.
Both of these comparisons, the reference to Blow Up and the reference to Twin Peaks, both of them ring true, but besides maybe a couple of overlapping factors, the really connecting tissue between these artworks or media forms are like they eventually do fall flat. It's not an entirely productive comparison for a full-on analogy, which kind of reinforces Karen's argument that this is a quite unique film in the way that it combines these alchemic elements.
Yeah, I think the only other film we're going to attempt on like doing something similar to is Nicholas Roeg's Eureka, which we're going to screen also alongside Spoorloos in the Fantastic Alchemy section, which is literally about the pursuit of gold. But of course, it's being literally read in this framework of a gold rush. And that kind of alchemical transformative aspect is often, I think, overlooked with regards to that film.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen Eureka, but I would say that if the film is on the surface about the discovery of gold or the transformation of, say, the labor of finding gold into the gold, then maybe it's not really alchemical. Like, in order for it to be an alchemical, to be open for an alchemical reading, it can't be on the surface. That's just a suggestion.
That's also an interesting meta part of the film Spoorloos, which is very much about the secrets that are literally buried underneath the surface.
Yeah, so maybe very pragmatically, because as we said, new readings unlock new perspectives. So Christina, when are we going to be able to read your book? Karen's has been around since 2009. So when is yours coming out?
So I'm due to submit the manuscript in the new year. And after all the kind of peer review and final stages, I'm hoping at the end of next year, my book will be released. So late 2024, early 2025. So about a year and a bit.
Well, a year always goes by faster than you anticipate. So that's very exciting news.
Yeah, hopefully I'm not too long from now.
I think nothing else rests than to give you a big thank you, both to you, Karen, and to Christina, for your fantastic contributions and analysis and this beautiful conversation about such an incredible movie.
Thank you both. It was such a pleasure. Well, all three of you.
Yeah, it was a true delight. Thank you so much.
Certainly has been. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And I really can't wait for the audience to be able to listen to that episode and have another look at Spoorloos. It's gloriously restored lately. So I actually can't wait myself.
I also can't wait to see it on the big screen. Yeah.
Excellent choice. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and bye-bye, and hopefully talk to you guys later.
Thank you very much. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Great to meet you. Thank you for a conversation. Bye now.
This was an episode of the Imagine Film Festival podcast exploring the theme of Fantastic Alchemy, hosted by us, Stanisław Liguzinski
and Hugo Emerzal. This podcast series is produced by Ines de Co and edited by Tom Ooms.
If you're listening to this before our upcoming festival edition, we invite you to come join us at Imagine Film Festival, taking place in Lab 111 and Filmhallen from the 25th of October to the 4th of November 2023. Check our website at imaginefilmfestival.nl for the complete festival program, or follow Imagine Film Festival on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok.
Thank you for listening, and make sure you tune in to the remaining episodes of the podcast. Bye-bye.
Bye.